right, Haley, thank you so much for coming over. I hope it's not too warm in here. Are you comfortable?
Absolutely.
All right, great. Thanks for coming over for the interview. I did my last one on Zoom, and this is so much nicer. I met Haley at a Live in the Wild walk, I think was maybe the first time I met you. Our friend Moshe does these great walks. They're kind of like a spiritual experience of being in the wild, supposedly. And sometimes he encourages people to only talk about what's happening now, which can be challenging for some of the participants. And so then ever since then, we've seen each other at different walks. And we just went for a hike together, which was so awesome. 4 nights and 5 days out in the woods. So got to know each other much better recently. And Haley is kind of a brain expert. She is now, I have to look my notes, a research associate at the Berkeley Center for Psychedelic Research. And she studied neurobiology at Georgia State. Is that right? Neuropsychology at Georgia State. And neuroscience at Loyola? How do I pronounce that? Loyola University?
Yeah.
Is that true?
Yeah, I did. To an extent.
But anyway, but yeah, I just thought she'd be a great person to interview because she's doing some meditation. She's very interested in psychedelics use in terms of personal development or different kinds. And I thought that would be really awesome. She has a lot of background in research and understanding other people's research into those subjects. And so yeah, but first I really thought it would be great to just get some basic kind of, did you have siblings?
Yeah, I did. I have one sister who's now in like kind of film and that kind of stuff, so really cool, kind of completely different direction than what I'm doing. I lived in rural Michigan, Traverse City, Michigan.
What about any kind of spiritual or religious background? Was there any kind of that in your family?
Not really. I would say I grew up primarily in a very agnostic household, I would say, and I would say that's still primarily kind of my beliefs around that, but I think that you can definitely, no matter how you fall on the spectrum of various spiritual beliefs, you can still definitely have a practice in spiritual experiences.
Sure. Yeah, so were you always interested in science? When you were in high school?
Since, as long as I can remember, I've been the person obsessively curious about what's going on around me, constantly asking questions. As a little kid, far back in elementary school, I remember being obsessed with just every type of science imaginable. And in high school too, I was really just fascinated by science in general, particularly biology, actually. And I had a science club even. It was really cool just I was really focused on trying to connect science to the community even then. I remember even when I was 15, I did a science talk about antibiotic resistance and the need to develop more antibiotics and stuff like that, but I got kind of sick of pure biology in a sense, because you can absolutely get kind of lost in the molecular pathways and stuff, and kind of fail to see how it's directly having an effect on people's lives. And what I study, I always want to be able to have a very strong impact on an individual's life. So I kind of got drawn into neuroscience in that sense, because it allows you to bridge the really like nerdy scientific stuff with the more applicable stuff, especially the way that I'm trying to bridge it with public health concerns and the hard science.
Right. So that makes me think about kind of this broader question of kind of worldview and what do you see as being helpful to people, like what kind of you say that will actually be applicable. How do you define what you mean by applying that science?
I think one thing about neuroscience that really is helpful about it is it immediately seems to draw people in. People are fascinated by it initially, and there's so much other scientific information that's really compelling, but when you show somebody a brain scan, they're automatically like, whoa, cool, I can see it, it's there, it's real. And even though when you actually get into the complexities of neuroimaging, it's not very clear cut. You can have completely inverse results based on the analysis method. But when you're showing people these studies saying like, oh, meditation can decrease default mode network connectivity, which is a network in the brain that is tied to being overactive depression and stuff, people are like, wow, it does have a biological effect. And that pulls them in to be inspired potentially to make lifestyle changes that are impactful.
The gurus have been telling us to meditate for thousands of years for various reasons, not just meditate, but just take different approaches to life, which of course I'm so interested in. But the science is kind of in some ways catching up, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
And so I guess when I was younger, I don't know when this was changed, but they thought that brains didn't develop or change. Like the number of brain cells you had was the same, and you could only lose them. They would never increase or something that doesn't sound it makes no sense now because I've heard about neuroplasticity and all this stuff. But it used to be you have what you had when you got to a certain age, and that was it. It's a pretty amazing science how it's changed around that.
Yeah. I think one thing to think about is you can be pulled in through learning about it from a spiritual method and the various different gurus or Zen or whatever, but some people that's just not going to pull them in because it's not tangible. But once people start having experiences with meditation, they might also see the value of those various philosophies as well. So it's kind of science in a sense then can be a gateway drug, if you will, to spirituality. It can go both ways, I think.
What's your kind of, if you could figure out what your main kind of worldview or understanding of how things work, so to speak? Is there any kind of that you kind of fall back on when you're trying to figure things out?
I would say at its core, admitting that nothing is certain and that our perceptions of things aren't likely to be at all accurate. I mean, from studying the brain, we know how malleable our perception is, and just a limited understanding of things. So that's kind of fundamentally every belief I have to have a degree of skepticism.
That's good. Yeah, that gives me a sense. Yeah, and that's so important, really, for me. I talk about that a lot in my book, actually, about how beliefs, if you get so attached to one particular set of beliefs and you're sure they're right, that's really sometimes very challenging. That can create a lot of suffering, really. And so being open to And that's really, of course, a true scientist would agree with you 100% because they would say, we keep finding out new things, and sometimes what we thought was true has to actually be thrown out, even at scientific levels. And, you know, some people may say certain scientific facts are invaluable, but certain others are just the best beliefs that we have now. And it could be wrong at some other level or some new understanding. But, so that's really cool. So let's get into some of the understandings around meditation and these psychedelics. I guess it's kind of two subjects, but maybe there's some good relationship between the two. In terms of consciousness, in terms of how we suffer this big fat organ, and how we can reduce that suffering. To me, that's the most fundamental challenge of being human, is dealing with this big fat brain, and how can I gracefully go through life without being assaulted by thoughts that aren't that helpful, or beliefs that aren't that helpful, and all these feelings that seem to come with them. Let's start with the newer kind of, because I think a lot of people have heard about the benefits of meditation here and there, but maybe not as many people have heard about that psychedelic medicines and drugs can be used, and historically have been used for spiritual purposes. What excites you about this field? What is it that you like about these uses?
Well, going back to just meditation and psychedelics overall, you look at how they're similar in the brain as well as subjective experience, and you find immense overlap. There's been obviously a lot of brain scan studies of people on psychedelics, and what they find over and over again is that disintegration, if you will, of the default mode network, of that network that's responsible for that constant, or it can be constant, ruminative thought. And really fundamentally it ties down to a person's sense of self, the feeling of I-ness, if you will. And in really deep meditation, people find that the same network also has a similar loss of integrity. The brain scans look pretty similar. They're not identical by any means, but it's enough where you can say, oh, there is an overlap. And then subjective experience as well. People having the same sort of fundamental mystical experience, according to like James's criteria for a mystical experience, feeling a sense of oneness with everything, having time stop. Similar things happen with both meditation and psychedelics. And interestingly, there was a study that kind of compounded the two, and they gave, people were at a 5-day meditation retreat, and on the 4th day they gave half the participants psilocybin, and they asked them to like report how deep they went in meditation, and it was much deeper and also much more likely to have a profound mystical experience. Both groups did have meet those criteria for a mystical experience, but it was far greater in the psilocybin group. But even more importantly than just effects during the retreat, they did a 4-month follow-up study. And during that time, the people who were in the psilocybin group, they reported greater overall life satisfaction, self-acceptance, and other benefits compared to the group who had just done meditation. And I believe that the effect was so strong that there was like a 1% chance that it was, the differences were due to chance, which is immense in science.
Now, do you know with that particular study whether they asked the participants if they continued to do meditation practice and what their frequency was of practice after the retreat?
I'm not sure. I would guess that they probably controlled for that in some sense, I would think. I know there was another study too, kind of similar, that for this study, they gave everybody a dose of psilocybin, various doses, and either they could be in a group that had high support, so that they would have like a meditation kind of circle meeting, and be encouraged to journal and that kind of thing, versus the other group just kind of periodically checking in a very kind of research official way. And the group both had psilocybin experiences, though. The group that had the support circle, the reported meditating much more frequently and other spiritual practices after their session, compared to the other group, which the benefits for them kind of faded away much more quickly. And they also, what they did that was really cool, is they gave somebody in the community who knew the person and had frequent contact with them a survey, just seeing if they saw any noticeable changes. And for the people in the high support group who were meditating more and being encouraged to do those practices, there was a significant difference in various like pro-social behaviors, if you will. So it definitely but not for the people who just took psilocybin in a research setting and then didn't follow up with it.
Right. Which is exactly why I asked the question about the previous study with the 5-day retreat, because my understanding of practice, from what I've learned and also from my own experience, is that the regular practice can make such a huge difference in how I feel. And the group practices that I've done, the retreats and whatnot, they're really wonderful for the benefits that come the days immediately following that long retreat. And the benefits of that long retreat going forward months later are less clear to me from my own experience. But I feel way more inspired to maybe even ramp up my daily practice after I've had this immersion retreat situation, because now I've seen how wonderful it can be to practice even more, for those days, coming back to life. It's like, wow, I was meditating once, twice a day. Maybe I'll switch to twice a day if I was only once. Maybe I'll start doing some of my meals, eating in silence for the first X minutes of the meal and without reading or watching something on video at the same time or whatnot. And so I think it's pretty important for like future studies, and I'm sure you're going to be involved in a lot of those in your career, to try to control for that. And that for me, that could be the biggest variable possibly with a 4-month follow-up type of thing, because that's a long time. In 4 months, if somebody's really devoted to their practice, a lot can happen, especially if they have those support groups that you talked about, where they're coming every week or so with a group that's also practicing. You can share the benefits and the challenges of practice. And you're much more likely to not only practice, but also notice the benefits that you're having from your practice, and they just build. Now, I guess you, on our hike, we had a lot of great conversations, and one was around different studies, and don't worry if you don't have the exact details, around different types of meditation. And that's fascinating to me as someone that's doing some teaching of meditation and learning some new techniques to offer to students and new meditators. So, first of all, I'm curious what kind of meditation practice you've enjoyed for your own practice, like what styles you've tried and what do you have any kind of a more regular practice yourself?
So I would say I first got decently consistent with meditation through mindfulness-based stress reduction. There was a group at my school that did that, and with that, what you're primarily doing is kind of, you're just like focusing on your breath while you're meditating, and they also teach you like body scan meditations, mindful walking, various things like that. But upon actually reading like the benefits for different types of meditation, based on the brain, of course, I found out that open awareness meditation, where you're trying as best as you possibly can to just observe everything in your environment. So you're paying attention to your breath, you're paying attention to how you're sitting, to the sounds that you're hearing, to any thoughts that are like crossing your mind without judgment. That supposedly is probably the most significantly neurologically beneficial. It looks the most like psychedelics in the brain, I suppose you could say, more than like when you're just, say, focusing on a mantra, which is another prevalent way to do it, and it's very easy for beginners oftentimes to just kind of like repeat over and over again. But that, when you're doing that, you're activating the parts in your brain that are responsible for speech production, and that's not quite strengthening, if you will, the neural pathways that you necessarily want to receive maximum benefit. But it's a great way to start, I would say.
When you're staying open to all stimuli, including thoughts, during that, does that mean that you're doing your best to stay super aware of your thoughts, but also letting your thoughts go wherever they're going to go while you're aware of them? And you're basically ruminating, or not?
So, trying to be so open to whatever is going on around you that you are too full of being aware of that to have any thoughts. That's the ultimate kind of place to go with that meditation. It's hard to do, and you can, like, even with a lot of practice, I've only been able to do it for probably a few seconds at a time, but that's what you're trying to achieve. And then if a thought comes in, just being aware of it in the sense of putting it in the picture of everything else that's going on around.
You don't get carried away by it, so you're not noticing the body anymore, right? Because you've got pressure on the seat, you've got the breath coming in and out, you've got a lot going on. And the more you've been practicing, the more of those subtle stimuli you can be aware of, is my experience. So it's constantly taking in the wide-angle view, so to speak, which is a practice I love, where you see how far apart you can take in your visual view. Mainly, we're used to just focusing in one place at a time, like we're reading a book, or we're on the screen, or we're looking at one person's face. And it's kind of like the wide-angle view of touch, and hearing, and all the senses. But is it usually done with your eyes closed or open?
Closed, yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I have at points tried to sort of meditate with my eyes open, because I've heard that in Zen practice they often encourage you to try to do that, so that you're kind of aware of like the oneness of everything. But I find it incredibly challenging to see everything and not be labeling it, which is what the point is, to just be with it and not think about it. So I try sometimes to open my eyes at the end of a meditation session, but it doesn't last very long.
Yeah.
Another technique that's interesting that we haven't yet talked about is loving kindness meditation, where you focus on basically sending out like positive vibes, if you will, to various people in your life, starting first with the people you know best and then expanding it outward to the whole world. But anyway, they've done studies with that, and they've actually found that it increases vagal tone, which what that means is there's a vagus nerve that runs kind of along your whole body, and it's really linked to a lot of various like health measures. And they found that it actually makes a person more healthy, as well as makes them more likely to engage in positive like social interactions and stuff like that. And there's kind of this whole model that potentially through loving kindness meditation or some other method, when you're building up all that positive emotion, that's building up your health through that vagal nerve tone change, as well as further catapulting you into having a positive experience just in your life in general, as you're more likely to make the social support necessary to be happy. So it's a positive upward spiral. So I find that's an interesting kind of model for how to explain things. And I'd like to be doing that type of meditation more as well. It's not as much of a default mode network inhibitor, if you will, but it's still helpful for the various other reasons I described. What I'm thinking about here is, I remember you saying stuff about there being a line between actually practicing and like rational thought not being able to necessarily like get you to a spiritual sort of place, if you will.
Yeah, well, so my understanding is that the intellect is very useful to decide to do spiritual practices, and then once you're actually doing the spiritual practices, it's not really an intellectual process. And so that they go together really well, in that you probably won't do the practices unless the intellect agrees to it. And I found it helpful to have an intellectual understanding of different kind of common stages of spiritual growth or development as consciousness rises. And because then when I have certain experiences, number one, I won't be freaked out by them, which could happen. And number two, it might give me a sense that I'm going somewhere. You know, I'm not just like a,
you're making progress.
Exercise. Yeah, it's like there's signs, I guess, but some are obviously, wonderful. You know, you would never say, oh, why am I feeling so great? You know, why do I love everybody? You know, it's like you just are, so it's great. You know, but it's also kind of, I think, helpful to navigate the terrain, so to speak. But what were you saying around how do you find that relationship?
So what I was thinking about in particular when I said that statement is, if you think of kind of what is the core of like the meditation experience or a psychedelic induced experience or whatever, it's that loss of sense of self is like the primary focus of your being. And I think that even through intellectual processes, you can find that as well, depending on how you're doing it. There's a phenomenon called flow state where you're so involved in a certain task that time seems to stop. And it seems to be happening automatically. And there is that decreased sense of self. And my guess would be probably it would look similar in the brain to the other states that we've mentioned. And so in that sense, I think that even writing a research paper, if you're fully engaged with it, it could be, in a sense, a practice. And it doesn't have to happen through an intellectual process necessarily, but it's just kind of the idea that anything that you're doing, if you're engaged with it enough, if you're present with it enough, could be considered part of your practice. And I think that kind of fits in well with like the kind of Zen philosophy that you like chopping wood can be a practice.
Sure. Sure. Yeah. Well, I'm not particularly intellectual in some ways. I was always weak in school, for example. But I've been in flow state a lot with windsurfing, for example, because I was so fanatical about windsurfing that I got really good at it. And my sense of that flow state with physical activities is that even though I was using the intellect to get to a certain level of ability, once I got to a certain level of mastery, it was more of the flow didn't involve the intellect as much. It was more of a automatic reaction to the environment that I'm in. And I could believe that it's possible to get into that state with the intellectual process. My understanding from different spiritual teachers and gurus is that's possible, but very challenging. It's a path that some people choose. It's just a path that fewer people realize through as compared to other spiritual practices that aren't as intellectually based.
But
so,
windsurfing, creative like things like being really involved with like photography or painting or whatever.
Yeah.
Whatever you are passionate about, whatever you are good at, you can find a way to integrate that into part of your practice.
Absolutely.
And to use meditation in addition to that to better whatever you're doing. So it's kind of another example of that like positive spiral effect, if you will.
Absolutely. I love that, and I'm very much into that. Just finding ways to have pretty much everything I do is a spiritual practice, really, because that's the intention anyway. And so, and it does improve my performance, I think, of everything that I do, because I'm staying with it. I'm just doing it as best I can. That's my mode of turning into practice is, if I'm interviewing you, I'm just interviewing you. And hopefully I'm not like getting distracted and thinking about a whole bunch of other things at the same time, because then I'm probably not going to be as present for you and whatnot. Just as one example. So yeah, I love that, and I think it's so important for people to know that that's not like a new thing. It's just that the tendency of our culture is to chop everything up into little compartments and then only recognize one of those compartments as being yoga, for example. Yoga is originally just means union. It's everything. And now we think of it in the West as being on a yoga mat, in a class or even by yourself doing physical postures. That's a beautiful component of yoga, but it's not the big picture that word originally meant. So yeah, I love that you're bringing up the using different activities.
I would say that a major barrier we face now in like just society in general to being able to do that, to accessing the flow state just in our lives through whatever means, is the constant saturation in technology. Our attention is constantly being pulled towards other things. If you have a phone on you and it beeps, you're gonna check it. And you think about like social media, for example, as well. It's designed so that you're spending the most time as possible on it, so you're seeing the most ads as possible. And they literally will send you notifications at the time where it's most likely to be addictive. They want to do it randomly and like sporadically, so it's, what is the schedule called? Remittent reinforcement. I don't know exactly, but it's designed to really pull you out of the present as much as possible and to focus on, oh, what are other people doing? Am I being liked by other people, etc.? And that's so, I think, ingrained in our culture, especially amongst younger people who've just like grown up with social media constantly in their faces, and you look at like the rate of like depression amongst younger people, and it's going up dramatically compared to what it was generations ago. And I think it's partially that increased social comparison, being pulled out of things to focus on how you are in relation to other people so much. And I think the remedy for that kind of problem is finding those activities which allow you to access the flow state more.
Yeah. Yeah. And shutting off the phone or putting it on silent, at least, means your flow state won't get interrupted by the temptation to grab it, even if you don't always grab it. Yeah. Let's hear a little bit more about how you got started with doing some meditation. And you told me it was a particular group.
Mm-hmm.
When was that group?
So that was fall semester 2019. So prior to that, I did do it periodically because I knew like, oh, it's really good for you, but I had trouble staying consistent. But I find that when you're around a group of people and you're checking in with each other, it's so much more, it's so much easier to stay consistent with it. And another thing too is that at first I was like, oh, I need to be meditating 20 minutes every single like time, and sometimes you have to set the bar low to stay consistent, and from there you can build up. So one thing I would really say to people who are starting to meditate but and they're wanting to jump into it and get benefits right away is just to start with very low amounts, but be consistent with it as consistent with it as possible, and from there you can build up once it's integrated into your schedule. And another thing too I would say is it's really helpful to have it kind of stacked, if you will, with another habit that you do, so that whatever it is, it's a trigger for you to remember to do it.
Yeah. So what do you tend to stack yours with?
Let's see, what's a good example? If I brush my teeth in the morning, then after that, I know that I should meditate for like 10 minutes.
Yeah, so do you aspire to practice meditation every day, or a certain amount of time at least?
That's something I think that even with starting this program in the fall and helping out with this research center, that I think is going to be like vital for keeping me pretty much sane during that time, because there's going to be a lot going on. So keeping a consistent meditation practice is probably like one of the like main things that I'll be doing to be able to handle it all. And also there's like so much evidence that meditation actually improves your like ability to focus and to be creative, on top of the mental health benefits as well. So you could think of it as a smart drug, if you will, but from your own brain.
Exactly, right. Well, it's been really wonderful to have the opportunity to talk to you about so many fascinating things. I appreciate it, and wish you the best for your new situation, your new school. Maybe you'll come back and visit Atlanta here and there to see old friends and go hiking again or something like that. We'll see. Yeah, I guess you can call it a wrap.